This morning I'd like to introduce Paul and Cynthia Stancioff. They are from Chesterville, where they've lived since 1987 and raised 2 daughters. Paul has recently retired from physics at the University of Maine, Farmington. He received his PhD in theoretical physics from Boston University in 1987. The two met at the University of Maine in Orono, where they were both doing graduate work in the early 80s. Cynthia's degrees are in English and in public administration. About 2 years ago, they began collaborating on their bi-weekly newspaper column called Energy Matters for the Sun Journal's affiliate local papers, the Franklin Journal, Bethel Citizen, and Norway Advisor Democrat. They're here this morning to explain what motivated them, what they hope to accomplish, and how it's going. Please join me in welcoming Paul and Cynthia.
Am I supposed to keep a mask on for speaking?
No.
Oh, okay, great.
Spit it off.
So, as you heard, we have very different kinds of brains, Paul and I. He's a mathematician, physicist, I can't even say it, who, really thinks in numbers. He sees in numbers. He dreams in numbers. I'm an English major with sort of a socially analytical mind, always wondering what people are thinking and he's like, you can't speculate. There's no right answer, but I persist. We often have nothing to talk about. But we do share some concerns about the world, chief of which for both of us is the environmental quandary of an out-of-control warming planet, because we both remember when such a thing just was considered totally impossible. But back to the different minds. I've always valued the fact that Paul could figure out and document what is real and what is unsubstantiated. He's acquainted with the laws of the universe, okay? Like, he understands them, not through intuition, but actually through those equations, those Einstein equations, that stuff. I've always found that reassuring, except when it documents alarming things. But at least then I know I'm worrying about the right things. So, over the decades, I've witnessed his dismay, frustration, anger, disappointment, mostly venting about news reports and articles and such by pundits about energy and climate-related things. The problems he has basically boiled down to the fact that they're all disregarding facts and data, and they lack a context, they lack a presentation of the proportions of the problem in all this public discourse about things for which there actually are correct answers, it turns out. So meanwhile, I have a mania for expressing those things that I feel the public needs to hear. How many times have I said, "Why don't you write a letter to the editor?" So the idea came to me that we could actually combine our strengths by using his understanding of all this stuff and my ability to summarize it and describe things in a way that people like me can understand it. So we could try to address energy topics we think people might be wondering about. As a bonus, we might end up having something to talk about with each other. So we decided to call it Energy Matters. The double meaning, of course, includes the subject matter's energy and the assertion that energy matters. Because in terms of our current climate chaos, it's pretty much about society's energy needs. So that's what we do. We think of a topic we sense people are perhaps confused or just curious about, and occasionally we just choose something we think they should know about. Then he does the research. He bangs it out on his laptop. I look at it and sigh. And then I have a sweaty couple of hours before the deadline, rewriting every sentence 3 times or 4. Then I send it back to him to see if my interpretation translation process preserved the truth part. This isn't easy. Often I'm rewording something I don't understand to make it understandable. You see the problem here. I think he's learning to proofread really carefully. So we've had fun with this, actually, overall, although at one point we seemed to be developing a routine with each approaching deadline involving a cycle of questions, threats, reprisals, and then escalating strife that made it almost not worth it. But the times that I ended up just writing it myself seemed to have scared him straight. He's been pretty cooperative lately. More and more we're receiving positive feedback, though, and it's nice to feel you're actually helping people understand things. So I think we'll probably keep it up for a while longer, and we welcome suggestions from you for any energy topics that we could cover. And I'll turn it over to the expert.
There's a little bit of overstatement there, but yeah, I do. Well, let me just go on with what I was going to say. So am I close enough to the mic? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Just a little overview first. As Cynthia said, our motivation overall is about climate, but we're not writing this column to scare people or to talk about doom and gloom. In fact, when we first started, we thought, let's not talk about climate explicitly, let's just talk about energy in practical terms. And our early columns were primarily like that. I'll show you some examples in a bit. Our intent is really to give people information that will help them make decisions about energy, whether it's at a practical level, like buying a water heater, what kind of decisions go into that, or it's at the policy level of, if you're concerned about things, how would you vote on energy legislation, or what would you want your congressman to vote on? What would you write about to your congressman if you wanted them to address any energy-related issues? We want readers to get a sense of how various actions fit into the big picture. How does what I do matter? We really believe that it's possible to transition away from fossil fuels as our primary energy source with existing technology, with sound policies and good public education. That's kind of what we're trying to do. And that we can do this transition equitably and without huge negative, wrong direction, without serious negative economic consequences. An energy transition like this is not going to be easy. It's complicated, and sometimes will be messy, and they use the term disruptive for technologies these days. But it is possible. To the articles that we've been writing, how do I proceed to get one of these articles going? Well, I do a lot of research on the topic. Once we've decided what we're going to write about, researching helps us decide kind of what the interesting things to say about the topic. I don't just collect information from the internet and just rewrite it in a way for the general public. That's the thing that really bugs me about a lot of reports that you read. They really just translating it and it's oftentimes misinterpreting it. I use my background, which is in physics, and a lot of years of teaching a course on energy here at UMF to synthesize this information and hopefully turn it into something for the public to grasp and to get some perspective about. It almost always involves some quantitative work. Help, math, help, right? And that's one of the difficulties, I think, with reporters, is they don't like to do the math. But the math is not always that hard. It's amazing what you can actually do with just a little bit of physics knowledge, and a little bit of arithmetic. But it has to be legitimate physics knowledge. You can't just make it up. To talk about some of the articles in a little more detail, these articles can be categorized in a variety of ways, but they're basically about making energy-related decisions. So, for example, practical everyday things like heat pumps. So we've written an article about heat pumps, how they work a little bit, how much they affect your carbon footprint, how much they cost, how much savings can you get compared to more conventional heating systems, and that sort of thing. That's the stuff I taught about in my energy classes. So, I have, I think, a good background to actually cover that stuff. We've written about electric vehicles, what kind of effects they have, how useful are they, do they really work? Water heaters, similar to heat pumps, we've written about water heaters. We wrote an article talking about comparing induction cooktops. I don't know if has anybody here used an induction cooktop? Do you like it?
Yeah, we just have
a single burner one. Yeah.
It's awesome.
And there's some physics involved in that, and there's energy savings involved as well. And it gets away from gas. If you're a gas person for cooking, induction is a good alternative. We've written about solar energy, and on the practical scale, how does some of the policies we have now in Maine work for getting yourself into using solar energy, whether it's on your rooftop or subscribing to a solar farm or investing in a solar farm. And then we talked about the little things like, do I unplug my cell phone charger? How much is that going to save me? That's a thing you can calculate pretty easily. Compare that to turning down your heat. That sort of thing can make a much, much bigger difference. So we compare those kinds of numbers. Tiny number, like unplugging your cell phone charger, saves you like 3 cents a year. No, I can't remember that number, I'm making it up. But turning down your heat saves you a very substantial amount. Hold on a second. Then another thing is understanding big picture stuff. Like how do the waste and carbon dioxide from renewables compare to fossil fuels? We can calculate this stuff, so we write about it. How much land will solar take up? I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. What kind of policies will lead to an equitable energy transition? We've written about carbon pricing, for example. Do we need transmission lines from Quebec? I won't get into that too much today. Understanding energy use on a per capita basis. How do we compare to China, for example? We all have heard that China uses way more energy than we use, but actually on a per person basis, they use about 1/3 of what we do. So what's fair? I don't know. I'm giving information to make you help those kinds of decisions. Another thing we do is try to debunk stuff that comes our way, either from letters to the editor, or emails from readers, and we like to address common misconceptions that a lot of people have about energy. And then we have some sort of general information for the curious. We wrote a series about the grid. What is this grid thing and how does it work? We wrote a 4-part series on it. So just for a couple more examples, I don't have too much more time here, but one of my mottos is this: we need numbers, not adjectives, not emotion or intuition. Of course, emotion comes into play when you make decisions about what you want and what you don't want. But when you make a decision related to it, you need more than just that. You need numbers. How do we do that? Well, here's a line I've heard before. Help! Solar panels are going to take up all of our farmland. How are we going to grow food? We all see it here at Bussy Yorks, right? People are freaking out. Oh my God, they're going to take it all up. Well, it's true that renewable energy resources will use substantial land area, but the usual question, is it a lot? You have to answer the question not by saying it's a lot, but by saying how much is it? It's a quantitative thing. But to figure this out is not difficult. I mean, okay, a person on the street might not be able to figure it out, but a little bit of physics and a little bit of arithmetic, you can get there. How do we do this? Well, first we measure how much energy is needed. You can find that out. How much energy does Maine use, for example? How much energy does the average American use? It's about 10,000 watts per person. That's 10,000, you can convert that to kilowatt hours per year, but this is a rate at which we use energy. It's like having 100 light bulbs plugged in at once. That's what we use on average. That includes everything that is done in the country. It's not just your household use. It's about all of the energy used for manufacturing everything and doing everything, transportation, and that sort of thing. How much energy, the next question is, how much energy can 1 square meter of photovoltaics generate? Well, I can answer that too. There's a little bit of physics involved in getting to this answer, but it's about 22 watts here in Maine. It's about 30 in Arizona. And then you say, well, then how much land is required on a per person basis? That's not hard to do. Now, if you know these first two numbers, you can calculate this. It's arithmetic. The answer is 10,000 watts divided by 22 watts per square meter, and you get about a tenth of an acre, a little over a tenth of an acre per person. Wow. Okay, I answered that question. How does that translate to Maine? Well, how many people in Maine? Well, it's about 1.3 million. How much total area would be needed in that case? Well, about 140,000 acres. Now, we're not going to use 140,000 acres for solar because not all of our energy is going to come from electricity, from photovoltaics. This is like the upper limit case. This is if we got all of our energy from photovoltaics on the ground with no other sources of energy. Anyway, I got to move on, but this is the kind of calculation we can do. We wrote an article using these numbers here. So we wrote another article about corn ethanol and how much energy comes from an acre of corn ethanol, which led us to make a list, as one of our columns is just this list. Oh yeah, by the way, what fraction of our farmland is that? If we use 12% of our total farmland in Maine, it would be enough land to power the state in principle. We're just putting an upper limit on these things. We're putting boundaries by using physics. We're not making predictions that that's what's going to happen. But this led to this column we call the Energy Matters Index, where we listed a bunch of numbers about interesting things. And I just wanted to point out one of them is when we compared corn ethanol to photovoltaics on the same area of land. How many miles that an acre of corn ethanol, if you generated ethanol and used it as fuel for your small SUV, it might be able to move you 2,500 miles in a year. That same acre of photovoltaics could move an electric car 2 million miles. In other words, there's a factor of 1,000 difference. This is huge. These are things I don't hear about or read about anywhere, which what is kind of what I'm trying to do. People are talking about using biofuels for aircraft. If we had farmland to supply biofuels for a jumbo jet, it would take 100 square miles of land for one jumbo jet's annual use. Okay, we have to move on because I want to give you time for questions. But I want to point out that all actions have impacts. Inaction also has impacts. Optimal solutions will only be found by appropriate measurement and comparison of those impacts, whether they're environmental, financial, or social impacts. And we're trying to give you ways of measuring some of those impacts. Anyway, all our past articles can be found on a blog that we store them all in. And I don't know if you can share that with your group here at some point. Okay, I want to stop there because I think I've already used up too much of my time. I want to leave some time for questions. Cynthia, come on. Yes.
Sure. So I've done some of things very similar to what you've done, and I've done some study where I was looking at the wind generators that are in California, and since 2001 up through 2019, it basically started out kind of flat at 2001. There was very, very few. And then by 2019, they had approximately 5 Hoover dams worth of wind generators. So I wanted to understand the effect of that wind as it was hitting the Sierra Nevadas going up over the Sierra Nevadas and literally slowing it down. So I also did a comparable study where I compared that against the water volume in Lake Mead, because that's the basin for Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona region. And what was amazing was that the wind generators, their total amount of energy that they were producing grew constantly up to about 2.5 Hoover dams, if you will, up to the year 2012. Then went flat for some reason up through 2017 before they started increasing again to get it up to 5 Hoover dams worth by 2019. What was interesting was when I compared that against the lake volume level at Lake Mead, it declined all the way up through 2012, was constant from 2012 to 2017, and then continued to decline again. So my stipulation in this was, is there a correlation between taking the wind out of the that's going over the Sierra Nevadas, and basically, since you're slowing that wind down, now you're not getting the rainfall to go over that basin area. So there seems to be about a 68% correlation between the two.
I've never heard this, but it's very interesting. I'm going to look into it. Thanks for pointing that out. I don't have any answers. I haven't heard of any climate-related impacts of specifically of wind turbines, but something to consider. There's always impacts, as I said earlier, and they have to be investigated. So yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Frank.
I'm curious about when the earliest energy concern that I can recall, going way back into the late 60s.
The earliest energy what? I'm sorry?
Yeah, energy concern.
Oh, concerns, okay.
Energy concern, yeah. Going back into the late 60s, and it was all premised on the idea that it was the underlying problem was the human population. You know, in your calculations, the capita part.
Yeah.
That there seemed to be a correlation between the number of people and the amount of energy needed. And what's curious to me about in the vast literature of climate change, there's almost nothing, relatively speaking, there's almost nothing said about population control. And the assumption now seems to be, okay, this is how many people we have, this is how many people we anticipate, because our world population continues to grow dramatically. And so how are we going to generate enough energy, clean energy for this number of people? So could you, and once you started to answer this question, I remember, and you had a pretty good answer, I believe. So could you?
You mean from a while back, from one of my?
A while back, yeah. I put this to you about, I think, 10 years ago, and you had an answer. But I was just curious about whether you're, what you think about that now.
I don't remember specifically the answer. Yeah, I mean, world population is an issue. Interestingly, a lot of the modeling for the effects of increasing population don't make a lot of difference in terms of how the transition process. I mean, I think a lot of I'm not an expert on population growth, but I think a lot of people are predicting that a leveling off of population would happen naturally at about 9 or 10 billion at this point. What are we now at? 7? Yeah.
I lost count.
And Cynthia.
If I may, one thing that is shown by climate modeling is when you put in inputs about what kind of things you can do to address climate, the warming of the atmosphere and so on. When you fiddle with population levels and your intuition is that, oh, well, cut the growth of population, or better yet, cut the population, how much impact will that have? And it really doesn't turn out to be a very important factor for some reason.
It's really complicated, the dynamics of how all of these things, population and efficiency and transition to to low carbon energy sources. It's a very complicated thing.
Also,
I think
with
somebody.
equitable climate policies, equity, when equity is featured in, it turns out that things like education of women and more income, family income, decreases population growth. So.
Right, true that. But also another factor is that with some of the developing countries, again, this has to do with equity, they do not all have to go through the same sequence of energy use that the developed world has gone through, namely burning a lot of fossil fuels and then trying technologically to transition to low carbon fuels. They should be able to simply leapfrog the carbon, the fossil fuel portion of it. They've done that with telephones now. A lot of these developed countries have never had telephone lines. Now they all have cell phones, for example. So there's ways around that. Question.
What are your thoughts on nuclear energy being a very highly concentrated source of energy for a very small footprint?
Yeah, nuclear is good for small area footprint and low carbon footprint. It's having a huge amount of problems getting a foothold for a couple of reasons. One is a practical one in that it's very expensive to install. There's hardly any new nuclear being developed. And there's also the political concerns. There's a lot of opposition. I'm not, inherently opposed to it. I'm for anything that would be viable economically and carbon foot-wise. Yes.
Have you heard of liquid fluoride thorium reactors?
I've heard of them. I know there's a lot of research going on in thorium. But as of now, the couple of things, one is the thorium and the other one are the small-scale nuclear reactors. I'm not really prepared to talk a whole lot about it right now. I mean, one thing I do really well is forget stuff. So, and numbers, I work with numbers all the time, but I tend to forget some of the results. So I'm always recalculating stuff that I've forgotten. Like for talking this morning, I said, I can't remember that number. I had to redo it. Yeah, in the back.
I was just wondering if you had to pick one thing for the average person to do to make a positive impact, what would it be?
It would be to stay in touch with your representatives, senators, congresspeople to take action on energy and climate. Yeah.
If you take a barrel of oil is 42 gallons, and when that gets fractioned out, 19 of those gallons go to automotive gasoline. About 4 gallons of that goes to jet fuel, 5 gallons of that goes to diesel fuel. That percentage is extremely difficult to change. I mean, if you increase the temperature of the reactor, maybe you can adjust it by a percent. You can't really, you're always going to get about 19 gallons of gasoline out of that barrel of oil. So my question is if we start to transition to electric cars, if we're going to continue to fly, then we're still going to have to produce that 19 gallons of gasoline. And we won't have the place to store it. I don't hear many people talk about that aspect, that if we're able to do even a 10% transfer over, then that means we're going to be storing lots of gasoline.
I think it's a great question. I don't have an answer for it at this time. That's the kind of problem that I bet we can solve. No. I mean, there's other ways of using. Again, I don't know the technical. I'm not a chemist. I don't know a lot about the details of the various types of fuels and how their burning rates and where you can use them. But I'm going to try to find the answer to that question. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that is really interesting, and you can do some research on it. I mean, we can't just stop and say, oh, I got to figure out how to store these 19 gallons of gasoline because I want to keep flying the same amount if I've always been flying. There's a lot of work going on in aviation energy use at all. There's now an electric plane that they're saying is going to be able to fly 500 miles with 8 passengers. Now, and it's probably going to be very expensive. But just like everything else, it's the start. Electric cars, similar. New electric cars are coming down to the rates of gasoline-powered cars. In a couple of years, you're going to be finding that you can already find used electric cars for reasonable prices. So, we need to use our imagination a little bit. There's a lot of really smart people out there that know how to do some of these things. I listen to a lot of podcasts by really smart people talking about all of these energy-related issues. I haven't found that particular issue yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's out there. Lisa.
So you said people email you and you have a debunking column. What are 2 or 3 of the myths that you constantly address?
I wouldn't say constantly. We haven't had a huge number of emails, but we got, an email from a reader over in Bethel area who sent us a little video with some claims that renewable energy were terrible for the environment. The example they used was a 100 megawatt wind farm, and they talked about how much iron ore would have to be mined to build it, how much concrete would be used, which generates CO2 when you make it, and how much plastic waste, composite waste would be generated from it. And so.
And wait, don't forget about the child labor.
Oh yeah, and they said that all of this mining would require child labor in countries we don't want to have to deal with. So I took that one example. There was a whole bunch of stuff in the video that was just plain wrong, but in this particular case, I said, well, okay, a 100 megawatt wind farm, let's say it has an average lifetime of 20 to 30 years. So I calculate how much energy will a 100 megawatt wind farm produce. That's an easy thing to calculate if you know what a megawatt is and what a year is. You just multiply the two together. It tells you how much energy it generates overall. So then I calculated how many kilowatt hours is that. And then I calculated how much waste would a coal plant produce to generate the same amount of electricity. Never mind how many years it took, just how much energy it took, how much energy it generated. And it turned out that the coal plant would generate about 40 times as much waste and would require mining of many times, I can't remember now, 30 times as much material to produce the same amount of energy. Not to build the coal plant, but mostly it was about mining coal and burning it. And it would generate 30 or 40 times the CO2. So, it was garbage, basically. And it was, this is terrible for the environment. They threw out big numbers, right? 50,000 tons of iron ore. It sounds huge. I don't know how many tons of concrete. And turns out that a wind turbine, the concrete you use for, let's say, the base, it saves the CO2 from that concrete would generate in a matter of weeks from when it starts generating electricity. So that's one example, Lisa. There are other ones, but I probably should stop. Any other questions? It's up to you. Yeah.
In 1850, there was a volcano that exploded, Mount Temora, in the Philippines. And by the year 1816, we had the year without a summer.
Yeah, I remember reading about that when I was a kid, yeah.
Right, and I think that was the whole idea of maybe getting an association to nuclear winter. Has there ever been...
You mean Carl Sagan kind of thing, yeah?
Yeah, right. It would put enough particles in the atmosphere to cool things down. Has there been any talk that you know of that we could use a nuclear winter to cool the atmosphere?
I think it's a great idea.
Well, thank you, Cynthia and Paul, very much. I appreciate your input. This was fascinating.
Thank
and
you.
Really, really interesting. We'll be sure to get that blog site out there for people to refer to. I know I'm really interested in going back and reading them. So, and you said Lewiston Sun Journal, is that right?
No, well, it's not in the Sun Journal. You can find it online out there. It's on some of their publications. It's in the Franklin Journal and, oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Bethel Citizen and the Norway Advertiser Democrat. If you subscribe, I think, to the Sun Journal, you can, if you just Google Paul and Energy Matters, you'll find it online. I've found it online as well. And plus, as I said, it's in our blog that we put up there.